Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. Cram is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Well, we are fascinated by death. At least I think many of us are, but we don't like to talk about it. We prefer to delve into the murky afterworld through entertainment. That's why shows like CSI did so well. And there have been similar spin-offs, movies, even podcasts. And of course, who doesn't like a heart-thumping read through a crime thriller novel? But the reality is not so simple and tidy as what you see on your screen. Shari Forbes can attest to that. She's a forensic scientist and Canada 150 Research Chair in Forensic Thanatology at the University of Quebec in Trois, Rivieres. She started Canada's first body farm, and she's here to talk about what happens to us after death. Hi, Shari. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I want to start off and kind of address that notion. Why do you think many people, and perhaps it's more so in the West, don't like to think or talk about death, but they do like to delve into it as a form of entertainment?
I think it is something to do with the West because many other cultures have no problems talking about death, and they actually see death as a celebration. We see it as something very somber, very morbid, and I think that, to me, that feeling of morbidity around it is what prevents us from wanting to talk about it because it seems sad and depressing and something we don't want to think about. But I think if we were in a culture where we saw it as a celebration of life and an opportunity to, have the good memories about people, we'd actually talk about it a lot more. And certainly around the world, you see that difference in cultures, in the way they treat the dead, in the way they celebrate the burial process, and then how willing they are to talk about it.
Yeah. Do you think that, so I guess the desire to then pursue death in entertainment is a way for us to actually address maybe our own fears, but in a non-threatening way?
Yeah, definitely. So the entertainment is fictional, and as long as it's fiction, it's not happening to me. That's kind of the mentality that you can convince yourself, I think, in psychologically. You can think about it like, I'm just watching this on, happening to someone else. This won't happen to me. Of course, we all know we're all going to die, but we're very happy to see it in an entertainment form. And I think also, with forensic science, because it's science, it becomes a little bit more desensitized, less emotional. And so people feel an easier connection to that and an ability to watch something that's not quite as emotional as talking about one's own death.
Yeah, right. There's a detachment involved in that. I'm always curious to know how people get into their fields, and I'm really curious to know why you decided to get into forensic science.
Yeah, I always had a fascination with crime. I used to love. So I'm pre-CSI days and pre-Bones, but I loved reading Agatha Christie and any kind of crime novel I could get my hands on. So that's what I did in my pastime. But I also knew at school that I enjoyed science. And so for me, when it came time to choose a university degree, it was a pairing of what I enjoyed professionally, that is science, with what I enjoyed in my spare time, which was crime. So it was actually a really easy option. And at the time in Australia, where I'm from, there was only one university that offered forensic science. So the decision was simple. But then how I got into decomposition is a slightly different story because we didn't really study decomposition or the human body in our degree. We focused on evidence, so paint and glass and fibres and hairs. And it was in my final year of my degree that we had to conduct a research project. And there was this really to me, really fascinating project about why bodies were not decomposing in a cemetery in Sydney, Australia. And this wasn't remotely forensics. I mean, it's really an environmental question, but they'd asked the forensic science department to help them understand this question. And so I chose that project, and it was the first time I'd seen human remains. I found the whole process fascinating. We got some really great results, and that just led me to continue to study that area. So that was really the beginning of my interest in studying human decomposition.
Oh, do you know, to me, it sounds a bit like solving a puzzle. And I just did a podcast on puzzles. Does that aspect of it fascinate you, the puzzle aspect of it?
Definitely. So the other thing I do in my spare time is jigsaw puzzles, and and I love doing those. If I'm not reading crime, I'm doing puzzles. Yeah, and it is. We say that to students as well, that if you love solving puzzles or being a part of the puzzle, you're not going to solve the whole investigation, but just even being contributing one piece to that puzzle is what we do as forensic scientists. So is that inquisitiveness? Definitely. I think the combination of those two activities that I enjoy doing is what led me to this career.
Well, you created Australia's first body farm, and then you came to Canada and you created our first body farm, which is in Quebec and not too far from Trois, Rivieres. Can you describe what exactly that is?
A body farm is a facility where so the general public can donate their bodies to science. But unlike how we would donate to a medical school to train doctors or dentists or physiotherapists, people are donating to forensic science research. So a body farm is actually an outdoor laboratory. It's not like a medical school. It's an outdoor nature area or a natural outdoor area with a high security fence surrounding it. And all the donors are protected. But basically, they just are placed naturally in that environment, either on the surface or in a shallow grave, or to mimic some other sort of forensic science scenario. And we allow them to decompose, and we monitor that process. We collect a lot of data. We have a lot of researchers working with each donor. And that's what a body farm is. They are very secure. I always like to mention that because respecting the privacy of our donors is our number one priority. But there's a lot going on. Once you get past that high security fence, there's actually a lot of activity in terms of researchers, training police, training graduate students, and many other things.
Do you know, I first came across that term body farm when I read Patricia Cornwell's book called Body Farm. And I understand that it was based on a real place, a body farm in Tennessee. That novel, I think, did remarkably well. People were fascinated by it. I think many people didn't even know that such a thing existed. Did you read that novel?
I did, and I was one of those people that didn't know it existed, even though I was studying forensic science at that exact time. That book was released in 1994 when I was still studying, and that was the first I had heard about such a facility in the world. At that time, it was the only facility in the world, so the only place that people could donate their bodies to forensic science research, and where somebody like myself could actually study human decomposition.
Yeah.
So,
and why does that make sense, having a body farm?
Because the way a human body decomposes is very different to animal analogues, which is what we use. And, it's like medical research. The best research is done on the people you're actually trying to treat. But of course, there's ethics and other legal requirements around both living research and research with the dead. But the reality is, for us to understand how a human body decomposes, the best way for us to do that is to study a human body decomposing.
Oh, so with the farm, you were saying that you have bodies and they are in a natural environment. Is that right, on this farm? So is nothing artificially done to the environment? I mean, is the soil just the way it is, or do you create different kinds of situations for different bodies on the farm?
We do have different scenarios. So generally we try to keep the site as natural as possible, because what we're trying to recreate is the type of terrain or environment where police and search and rescue groups would be searching for victim remains. If I sort of go back one step, the type of people we're actually trying to help are those where their bodies haven't been recovered quickly. Because the majority of people, when they die, they'll die in a house or a hospital, and we know what happened to them. So this is a small percentage, but it's a very challenging area for police to try and locate victims or human remains that have been missing for some time and are in very remote outdoor areas. So that's why we're trying to recreate the natural scenario. But we do, if in order to mimic forensic investigations, we do sometimes have to disturb the environment. If we want to bury a body to recreate a shallow grave, then we'll dig a grave. But it's still a fairly minor disturbance. Generally, we don't, do too much to the area, because we want it to be realistic for both our students and for the police.
So how does a body decompose?
Well, it's very dependent on two things. It's dependent on the person themselves. So we call those intrinsic factors, and there's lots of things in our bodies that can change the way we decompose. If we're taking medication at the time of death, if we've had chemotherapy or radiation, just even things like our diet, our health, if we're obese, all of this can change the rate of decomposition. And then there's the external or extrinsic factors, which is the environment. And that also can change decomposition. In fact, it probably has the greatest impact. And it's the reason we have these facilities in different environments, because we know that will change the rate of decomposition. And all of that's important because we use the rate of decomposition to estimate how long somebody's been deceased. So it is important that we study these processes, particularly in Canada with such a cold climate and just completely different environmental factors to the rest of the world. That really changes how a body decomposes, and my ability, or forensic scientists' ability, to say how long that person has been deceased.
But if you were sort of just to take an average example, are there certain kind of stages of decomposition that you could talk about?
Yeah, there is. We do have what's typically called 5 stages of decomposition. So the fresh stage is, as it sounds, immediately after death, when the body still appears fresh and intact. The second stage is bloat, and that's when the process is really commenced internally and there's a build-up of gases and the body distends. And then the active decay stage is the most active. Again, these terms are pretty visually descriptive in terms of there just usually being a lot of insect activity, which causes liquefaction of the remains, and this is where the body really starts to disperse into the surrounding environment. And then the 2 final stages are advanced decay, as it sounds, and skeletonization, where there's really just hard tissue left. And so it's mostly bone, but it can also include teeth and hair, because these are materials that survive the degradation process. And we can look for bodies in any of those stages. So that's why we have to study that entire process.
And so I imagine you use all kinds of tools to help assess what's going on.
We have a lot of different disciplines that are involved, if that's what you're referring to. So
I was thinking of technology.
Yeah, so we have people studying fingerprints, so new technologies to recover fingerprints from decomposed remains. We have biologists who study DNA, so they're looking at DNA profiles, how long we can use those to identify a victim. But we have, a lot of environmental technologies, so looking at drones and aerial search technologies to help police find remains. Not everything we do is about identifying the victim. Our mandate is sort of improving methods to search for victims, to locate, to recover, and then to identify. So anything that can help with those. But yeah, there's a long list of people and disciplines and tools that we are constantly testing so that we can give that information to the police to be used in real investigations.
You mentioned that insects would be involved. Was it stage 3? Was it the third phase that
They can
might be
really
involved?
be present at any stage, but they're
Yeah.
most active at the active decay stage, definitely.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know if this is true. You tell me, but I think I read somewhere that insects were really valuable with forensic investigation. Is that true?
Yes, it is correct. So in the first approximately 72 hours, so we'd say that was the fresh and bloat stage, forensic pathologists can estimate time since death quite reasonably. But beyond that, the best method that we have is actually forensic entomology. So at that stage, the insects are quite active and they have a life cycle that generally correlates with time since death. So if we collect insect evidence, and we always encourage that to happen at a crime scene, then we can actually use them as a reverse clock where we kind of count back. Well, if they're in this stage, they must have been on the body for at least 3 days, which means this person has been deceased at least 3 days and maybe longer. So they're very valuable, and they are our best tool for decomposed remains in terms of estimating time since death.
And are we talking about certain kinds of insects?
Yeah, so mostly flies and some beetles, but it is predominantly flies and their larvae that are used. We call them forensically relevant flies because, of course, there's many, many species of flies, but not all of them are attracted to human remains. So it's those that are attracted to human remains that lay eggs, and those eggs then form larvae and go through that life cycle. And they're the ones that we can use to estimate time since death.
And how accurate can you get with time of death?
Not as accurate as we would like. So it's usually, the shorter the postmortem period, the more accurate will be, and the longer, the less accurate. So if it's only a matter of days, then it could be that they could estimate it to the day, or if it's a matter of weeks, even then they could maybe still estimate to the day. But once we start talking months or years, then of course we're maybe estimating months or years. And sometimes only season. Maybe the best they can do is say, well, it was after the snow melted that these insects laid eggs, and therefore they maybe were placed in spring. But that might be the best we can do. But all of that information is still very helpful from an investigative perspective. So that's why we still use forensic entomology for estimating that period.
To me, it sounds like such meticulous work. So detailed. And then there are so many factors that are involved, and those are only the ones you know of. There could be, right? Like surprise, unknown factors that come into play.
Definitely. And that's why we have these facilities and we do research, because those surprise factors are discovered almost every year at different facilities. We, for example, discovered that one of those forensically relevant species, we assumed once the snow falls, the eggs die and the larvae die, and that's the end, and then the cycle starts in the spring. But in fact, one of those species has larvae that just enter diapause, so they just hibernate over winter and then re-emerge. But of course, that's important, because if they're emerging in spring and we're saying, oh, they look like they've been here for 3 days, because we're thinking it's after the snow's melted, that's not the case. They've actually been there for more than 6 months. And that's what we're using to estimate time since death. So all of these factors surprise us on a daily basis, but they're all important information that we use to improve the way we estimate this period.
Can you take us through a particularly interesting case that you've worked on in the past?
Yeah, I worked on a case. This was when I was in Australia, and this was a person who had been missing for 10 years. And it was believed that his partner was responsible for his death and subsequent burial. And we had good information. The police had good information that he had been buried. And by this particular individual. But I think what was really interesting about this case was that the police spent 10 years actually working on this case. And I know there's a lot of misconception that, once they can't find them in the first few days, the police give up and it's a cold case and they won't look at it again. And that's really not the case. It does become a cold case, but there are units that are dedicated to looking at these. And so for me, it was really interesting. I wasn't involved for the 10 years. I was brought in right at the end because the police had narrowed down a search area. And speaking of tools, they were asking us what tools can we use to try and locate where this individual may have been buried. And so we suggested using cadaver detection dogs. We suggested using ground penetrating radar. There's a number of tools we've been testing and which are commonly used for these kinds of scenarios. But what was really great was the combination of those tools actually were successful, and we located the individual. And his family had actually attended the site every single day whilst we were searching, whilst they were digging. So for them to be present the moment that we recovered this individual, and importantly, what we recovered, and this was some other research that we've been doing, was the tag that is often on the back, a label on the back of a T-shirt. And we had an image of this individual when he'd gone missing, so we knew what shirt he was wearing, and the label was the brand. And so for the police to be able to say just immediately, we feel really confident this is him, and to turn to the family who were standing there and to say, we think we've found him. After 10 years, I mean, that was really special. But it just highlighted, the work we do. We study textile degradation. We study how dogs locate bodies. We use GPR. It all kind of came together for that particular investigation. And it just reminded us that, what we do is useful and that we need to keep doing this research, because even if it just works for one investigation, that's all it needs to do.
So even though the police were pretty confident based on that label that they found so 10 years, that label didn't get
everything else was degraded. There was nothing left of the T-shirt, just the hem, just this line around the neck. But it was just
what was the label made out of?
It was a synthetic material, whereas the T-shirt was cotton. And that's some of our studies we knew that natural fibers degrade much more quickly than synthetic fibers. Again, that was information the police had asked me. So what can we expect to still recover if we find him? Yeah. And, it's things like zippers or buttons or buckles from belts, any kind of metal, leather, definitely. So a leather belt will survive. But I had not thought of labels, actually. So that was new information for me as well.
Now, even though they were quite confident this was the man, did you still have to do a forensic investigation to absolutely identify him?
Yeah, 100%. So his skeleton, because he was skeletal, was collected. There was an anthropological analysis. And thankfully, they could also, even after 10 years, get a DNA profile. And because his family was still living, they happily gave their samples to compare for that familial relationship. So they did identify him through DNA. They could have also identified him through teeth as well, but it wasn't required in this scenario.
And what about, was an estimate of time of death required?
It wasn't in this case because we knew when he had gone missing. And so my role here was very much more around helping them to search and also predicting what we would find. So they had asked about clothing. They'd asked about, are we looking for skeletal remains? Would there be any soft tissue that would produce an odor for the dogs? What kind of depth the grave might be at. So there was also a forensic psychologist involved for profiling. So there were a lot of people consulted on this case over the 10 years, and particularly when we had an area of interest to search.
Yeah. I see. I find that so interesting when first of all, the fact that the label survived, but the rest of the T-shirt didn't. And then you were mentioning all the other things that might survive, like buckles and other perhaps synthetic materials and leather. Have you had many surprises in the cases that you've done where something has come up that maybe you weren't expecting? Some clue, some piece of evidence, or Yeah, a factor, perhaps.
Not always. I mean, usually what we predict is quite accurate, just because we've seen enough of these cases. I think that was probably the most surprising evidence in this case was the label. There are times that we might predict after 2 years we believe the body would be skeletal, and when we recover them, in fact, they're completely preserved. But usually when that's happened, it's because there's some other factor acting on the body that we didn't know about. So maybe they were wrapped in a plastic bag or something that, would help to retain them. So once we recover the individual, we can say, well, yes, the plastic wrapping will definitely preserve a body, but we didn't know that they were going to be in a plastic wrapping. So
what about though? What about factors that would influence the body's decomposition and your analysis that the public probably wouldn't be aware of? Can you talk about that?
I guess factors that accelerate decomposition, for example, that most people don't think about is vertebrate scavenging. And so most people don't think about that there's a lot of natural animals in our environment, and that they just see a human body as a food resource. And so if they're present, they will accelerate decomposition. So, for example, we had a case in Ontario where when we recovered the individual, they were completely skeletal. And from my estimation of time since death, if I just based it on, microbial or bacterial degradation, I'd say, well, this person must have been there for 6 months to get to that, to go through all those stages. But in fact, there'd been extensive vulture scavenging, and the person had been there for 2 weeks. And so if we don't take into account these factors that we don't always want to think about, or maybe we forget to think about, again, it can impact our ability to accurately estimate time since death. So I think for me, I'm doing a lot of scavenging research at the moment because it's been really overlooked in Canada. We have a lot of big animals and some small ones like the vultures, who are very active scavengers, but that we haven't really assessed in terms of how they change decomposition in our environment.
Yeah, and that makes me think about the body farm. And the body farm is one set of conditions, right? The one in Canada, in Quebec, it's a particular kind of weather and season that affects the body farm there. And then I'm thinking, how then do you extrapolate that to other places? Because perhaps vultures don't necessarily come to that body farm, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, yes.
And people die in, they don't necessarily die in a situation like a body farm. Maybe they died in water, or maybe they died, unfortunately, maybe they were in the trunk of a car, or so how do you kind of now bring all that into play as well with the evidence that you get from the body farm?
Yeah, and it's true we can't extrapolate a lot of our data. So we can to, Quebec and Ontario have similar climates, so we can extrapolate to Ontario, perhaps even New Brunswick or Nova Scotia to a degree. But we're not extrapolating our data to British Columbia, that's for sure, because their climate is very different to us.
Right.
Even the prairies is very different. And so given that we only have one human decomposition facility or body farm, we do still use animal analogues to study much of those other areas. But ultimately what we recommend, and my job, is to try and have more of these facilities. In the US, there's 10 facilities, and they cover a really good range of climates from north to south and east to sort of Midwest. And long term, that's what we need in Canada. We need east, we need central, we need west coast, we need right up north, in the territories. And that's the only way we can truly get accurate data, and especially for things like water, what happens in water. Our body farms are not in water, so we can either recreate or try and create a body farm underwater, or in the interim, we just use pig carcasses as analogues for that research.
Are there any body farms in water?
I'm working on one.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have colleagues, and we're trying long term, very long term, because this is
Ah.
a challenge that none of us have attempted anywhere in the world. But long term, we are trying because we understand, especially for countries like Canada with so much water, there's a lot of missing people recovered from water. But equally, on a global scale, there's a lot of need from a humanitarian perspective. So, people crossing large bodies of water in boats for migration, for
Mm-hmm.
immigration, and those boats are never safe and will often sink. There's a lot of air crashes that occur over water. There's a lot of reasons that bodies end up in water. Intentionally or unintentionally, and there's a need to study that process and improve the way we actually locate them. If we think locating bodies on land is challenging, I mean, water is really just a whole other level because of the depth and the sheer vastity of the area that needs to be searched.
Yeah, wow. So you're working on that now. And I know as well you have a special interest in cadaver detection dogs, and you mentioned that earlier that they were used in that case. Can you talk about them and how they're trained? What kind of dogs you would use?
So often the breed is very dependent on the police service, but they tend to use Labradors in Canada and Shepherds, German Shepherds. In Australia, we tended to use Springer Spaniels or smaller dogs, and that's to do with the type of terrain they're searching. So the land in Canada is very different to the land in Australia, and the climate as well. But they're trained. Usually, if we can train them, they're trained on human remains. So in Canada, all of our police cadaver detection dogs come to the body farm for training, but that's not the only training they do. The dogs have to be trained repeatedly every few weeks to keep having exposure to the odour, what we call the target odour, which is the odour they're trained to find. So there's a whole
Sorry, this
array
would be the odor of a dead person. Is
of
that
a
right?
dead person,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's a
But isn't
whole
everyone's
array
odor
of
different? Isn't no? Are
during
people's odor?
during life, our odour is unique. It's as unique as fingerprints or DNA. But after death, we're finding with the research we're doing that it becomes a more generic decomposition odour. So there are certainly differences, but the dogs are not looking for the differences. They're looking for the commonality in decomposition because they want to be able to find that odour for different people in different environments at different stages of decomposition. So they need to, understand which compounds are actually relevant to them in terms of their target odor.
Okay, so let me just try to understand that. So our bodies would have different odors depending on the time of decomposition
Yes,
of when
they
this
do.
is happening.
That's correct.
So do you then make a kind of an educated guess as to the time of death or how long that person has been out there, and then you try to match that odor with
We
a body in the farm, and then like how does that
No,
work?
we just try to have training aids that are all those different stages. So we try to have fresh tissue that they're exposed to. We try to have decomposing or active decay tissue. We also have bone that they train on. We train them on
Ah,
teeth. We call it the decomposition odor spectrum, and we try and cover them across that entire spectrum. So it's important to expose them to all the things that we want them to find. It could be a
right.
whole body, it could be a part of a body, it could be a bone, it could be a bone fragment. And all of that has to go into their training schedule.
Oh, so then how many different odors might they have to be familiar with?
A lot.
Oh,
It could be about a dozen different odors. Again, as I said,
right.
decomposition odor becomes more generic. So there
Yeah,
comes a point that, even if it's active decay versus advanced decay, it still probably smells the same.
yeah,
So there's probably around a dozen different odors that we would repeatedly expose them to
yeah.
over time. And those training aids continue to decompose themselves with time. So they're just getting naturally that transition of decomposition as they keep training, weeks,
Yeah.
months, years.
And then how does it work specifically when you are using a dog in a certain case?
So, as in, how do we use them
The dog,
to
yeah,
search
yeah.
or?
And what are they going for any kind of smell, one
Yes.
particular smell?
Yeah, no.
Oh.
So dogs can generalize, what we call generalize across odors. So they've learned all of these odors are important because they get me a reward, and that reward might be food or it might be a
Ah.
ball, but both of those are very important to the dog. And then they kind of just memorize all of those. And then so when they're told to search or to find, they go out saying, okay, this is what I need to find, because if I find this, I get my reward. And that's all they really care about. They don't know it's decomposition odor. It could be explosives that they're trained on. It could be drugs that they're trained on. They just know this odor gets me a reward, and that's what I'm working to find. So they do, they can generalize, across 10 different explosives. They can generalize across all the different drugs. We train them on all of those, and then it's in their memory bank that these are the important things.
And how successful are they?
It really varies, but in my opinion, highly successful. I mean, in training, they're usually more than 90% accurate in terms of alerting on the correct odor, often 100%. Most days they'll be 100%. We do have to remember, though, they're biological beings like us. They have bad days. There's days they don't want to work, they want to take a weekend. So some days they don't do as well, and that's fine. You keep them in their training, and then they'll excel again. But generally, I find them the best tool for searching. I think they're better than chemical instruments, electronic noses and all these other things we design, because they're far more sensitive and they can just search much larger areas much more quickly.
Oh,
it's
even
not to
better
say
than
they're perfect, but
You were mentioning earlier, was it the radar you used as well?
Yeah.
Is that a different purpose, or would it be similar to what the dog does?
So the ground penetrating radar is purely looking for burial. So it's something buried beneath the ground. So it's looking for a disturbance. It's sort of complementary, because we would use it when we had a very small area to search, like at somebody's yard, if we were looking in the yard of a house that we thought maybe there was someone there. And it's good because it can read below the ground. Whereas the dogs, if they're searching for buried remains, they're relying on the odor coming up from the ground and coming to the surface. And there's many reasons that could prohibit that. The soil type, if there's a lot of water in the ground. We don't always know if that odor is available to them. And if it's not, they won't alert. And that's where the ground penetrating radar can still come in handy. So we can search that area with the dogs don't give us a response, but rather than saying, okay, they're not here, then we search with the ground penetrating radar, we get something and we say, okay, maybe there is something here. And so that's why we call them complementary tools. They work in different scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing when you talk about, there's so much involved. It's so complex. And I mean, this could be one missing person, right? And all these people involved, all this technology and dogs and evidence. I can't imagine what it must be like when you're dealing with multiple people. And I have interviewed a forensic expert in the past who was identifying bodies in mass graves after a genocide. And I remember she said, this was such important work. It was a calling for her because she really felt that she had to speak for those people who no longer had a voice. We're facing something similar in Ukraine now, with mass numbers of people being killed. What would be involved? I know you haven't had experience doing that, but what would be the sort of the factors involved in something like that?
It's really the same kind of things we've already discussed. So it's about trying to find those mass graves and using similar tools. So maybe using dogs, maybe using ground penetrating radar, probably using aerial search technology, because at the moment people can't get on the ground safely. But also because of the size of these mass graves, you can actually see them more clearly from air. So I know there is some satellite imagery that's suggesting they're there. And there is on the ground, information about that as well. But that's the thing about all of these techniques is most of them can be applied to single graves or multiple graves or mass graves. And so even though the research we're doing might just be over, one donor buried in the ground, ultimately we hope that that can be extrapolated to scenarios like Ukraine, which we are being asked to assist with. And particularly with Ukraine at the moment, because their climate is cold like ours, and we have such limited knowledge of what's happening with bodies in those kind of environments. So not even knowing if they're decomposing, what will there be to recover? How are we going to recover them? And as I said, first finding them to be able to do that recovery.
Yeah. So you've been asked to assist. Do you have any idea what the timeline of that might be, when you might be going over, or?
No, I don't. I don't even know that I will go over. A lot of what we do is advising, and there's teams that are dedicated to being there, such as the Red Cross and other international teams. And usually, it's about us providing advice on what to expect, and then what can be anticipated. So, what materials they can take with them to assist with searching, or what tools. And what they can expect in terms of the recovery process. In terms of the timeline, sadly, this will be years. This is always the case with these kinds of wars and war crimes, is that the process of recovery of victims usually is years, if not decades, after the fact.
It seems to me that this field of forensic science is relatively young, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And it just sounds like, you said you're working on, an underwater body farm. There seems to be so much still to do. Where do you see this field headed? What would you like to see happen in the near future?
I'd really like to see a lot more of the facilities. What we've shown with the facilities is they are the best way to study human decomposition, that as much as we still use animal analogues, and we all do, they don't really compare. But logistically, to open a body farm is a challenge, and we understand that. But there is a real momentum at the moment to open more of these facilities worldwide. And I think that momentum will increase as people realise the importance of these. So at the moment, there's only one facility in Europe, but there's at least 5 other countries talking about starting one. And I think just, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment is really going to advance that discussion and the reality of those facilities very quickly. Because as soon as the whole world can relate to what you're doing and why it's important, then some of the hurdles that we face to start these facilities can be overcome quite quickly. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see facilities on land, underwater, all across the world. It won't happen in my lifetime, but I hope at least we see an advancement in some of the regions of the world where there's really a lack of information.
And are you getting enough bodies for the body farm?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay.
Every facility gets more donors than they can accept. That is the reality. And that's one of the big questions when people propose opening a facility is, who's really going to donate to this, and are you really going to get people donating? And that's actually not a concern. Most of the facilities just, the generosity of their local community and their local population, and not even local. I get requests from all over Canada for people to donate. It's really surprising. I think people are surprised
that is a surprise.
By how many people want to donate. And so, no, to the best of my knowledge, no facility has ever had a problem with donors.
Well, much success with your work, Shari, and thanks so much for sharing it with us today.
Thanks very much.
That's Shari Forbes. She is a forensic scientist and Canada 150 Research Chair in Forensic Thanatology at the University of Quebec in Trois, Rivieres. For more info on Shari and her work, you can check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram Podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.